As a lifelong gamer and a child of the 80s who was playing video games when I was as young as 3 and 4 years old, and we are talking in the early 80s before the NES was ever released, I can confidently say that 1996 will go down as one of the most important years in gaming history, as well as one of the most important years for myself and my gaming fanship, because it was the year that the Nintendo 64 was released into the world. So today in this video, I want to spend some time talking with you guys about why the Nintendo 64 is my personal favorite video game console of all time. And of course, I just qualified a bit here in that intro that I am an old man, and I've been gaming since the early 80s. I was playing video games on my Atari 2600 before the NES was released, before there was a Sega Master System, which is just a way for me to say, and many of you have heard me say this if you've been following my channel for any length of time, I've seen the video game industry grow from that early 80s period, post-video game crash, through the video game revival the NES created, through all of the different generations, the death of Sega, the introduction of Sony, the introduction of Microsoft, the introduction of mobile games, the motion control fad with the Wii, and everything that changed through that. I've seen every company go through all of these different shifts. I even went through the amazing time of all of the weird consoles that were introduced in the mid-1990s. I've talked about this a lot before on Twitter. When you had the 3DO, you had the CDI, you had the TurboGrafx 16, Nintendo tried something goofy with the Virtual Boy, which I own, by the way. And then, of course, there's my favorite weird console of all time, the Atari Jaguar and Jaguar CD, both of which I also own and still play today. And so more than anything, I'm hoping that you'll find it interesting to hear somebody who has that kind of breadth of history and experience with the gaming industry going back to the pre-NES days, discuss what they think is their favorite console, or what they say is their favorite console. And so all of these great machines, the PlayStation 2, the original PlayStation, the Super Nintendo, the GameCube, the Xbox 360, the Atari Jaguar, all of these consoles that are great and most people love. Obviously, I'm unique when it comes to the Jaguar. It's not actually a great system. It's just a personal fan favorite more than anything. All of these consoles, the revolution that was the Nintendo Entertainment System. I'll never forget my memories of my older brother bringing the NES home when I guess I would have been 5 years old. When he brought that home and I saw The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. For the first time. It is burned into my memory. The first time seeing those games on our old, huge 1980s TV. Out of all of these consoles and all these companies that have tried their hand at making consoles, the Nintendo 64, weird as it is, goofy as the controller was, strange and inconsistent as the library was, yeah, I think it really is very much my favorite console, and I can admit that a lot of it is being fed by nostalgia, but I don't really care. This isn't about me qualifying the best console ever made objectively. This is about my favorite console. And even though there is a huge Samus-sized hole in the library of the Nintendo 64, I don't care. It's definitely my favorite gaming experiences, my favorite memories of playing games and being excited for gaming hardware. It really, to me, comes down to the Nintendo 64. Now, just to put a little bit more perspective on this, it should be noted that in 1996, when the console released, I had just turned 16. And by the time we actually got the console, which I want to say was maybe early 97, I can't say for sure, but I do remember my mom or my dad, who were both divorced at the time and living in different states, both of them were trying to find a Nintendo 64 for the Christmas of 1996 when the console launched, for both my brother and myself, and neither of them could do it. Because the Christmas of 96, for anyone old enough who lived through it, the two big hot items that were impossible to find was the Nintendo 64 and something called Tickle Me Elmo. But of course, we're not here to talk about Tickle Me Elmo, we're talking about the 64. And because that console was so impossible to find, our two parents were just unable to buy one, so I remember sometime after Christmas, so this would have been like early to mid 97, someone was able to find a Nintendo 64. I actually think it might have been my dad, who found one in a KB toy store. He was living on the East Coast. We were living in Denver, Colorado at the time. And as a 16-year-old, I eventually got that 64. I'm pretty sure I remember it coming in the mail from my dad. Sometime later, I'll ask my mom if she remembers who bought that for us. But either way, we got that 64. early 97, mid 97. The console had been out for probably less than a year at the time. And so being a 16-year-old, a teenager in my mid-teens at the time, if you think about it, and I can fully admit this, it's a very impressionable time when it comes to both things that you enjoy, the things that impact and influence you heavily, maybe define some of your opinions on things going forward. And this could be real life stuff like the jobs you want to do, the politics you care about, the religion you want to follow, if any at all. It could also have to do with fun things like what's your favorite movie, who's your favorite actor, what's your favorite video game or video game console, right? Those are formative years for our brains. And I think that being 16 when the Nintendo 64 came out, and somebody who had been gaming for 13 of those 16 years up until that console came out, I experienced the transition from 2D to 3D gaming. And yes, the PlayStation and Saturn were very cool, and I played a lot of those as well at the time. But the Nintendo 64, I just think made a bigger impact, A, because I spent most of my time playing on Nintendo consoles, right? The NES, the Super NES, the Game Boy. We did have a Sega Genesis, and I played a ton of Sega Genesis as well. But Nintendo was always that big thing in the 80s and 90s. It carried the video game industry for like 2 decades. Really until Sony became the next major player to shift things in different directions. But the PlayStation was introduced at the same time as the 64, so it's all very interesting when you put it together in your heads. But being a Nintendo fan, following the shift to 3D gaming 90% through the lens of the Nintendo 64 and that crazy controller, man, it was awesome. Something else that's worth noting when it comes to the Nintendo 64, again, older gamers or video game historians will know this, it was initially revealed as the Ultra 64. I still have wonderful memories of flipping through gaming magazines, GamePro, EGM, Nintendo Power. Those are the ones that always come to my head from that era, but there certainly were others as well. But those 3 main ones, EGM, GamePro, and Nintendo Power, covering the incoming next generation console from Nintendo, and it was the Ultra 64, and you could find images of what all the, the console design was finalized and the shape of the cartridge design was all finalized, but it was called the Ultra 64 before being rebranded to the Nintendo 64 closer to launch. I can't remember the timeline because it was a long time ago, but that is what happened. And something else I'll never forget, you guys, is the first time I ever saw a picture of the controller. That's right, this goofy thing right here, man. I still have a Nintendo 64. It's not the one I grew up with. It's one I've acquired over the years. It's, this was so long ago. And so, I had the original regular gray one. Nowadays, there's tons of different ones. And this one's even a repro I had to buy from the retro gaming store. It doesn't have the official Nintendo logo, but, it's a Nintendo 64 controller. And I'll never forget the first time on a magazine cover, one of my friends was over in the basement, too, where our Sega Genesis was kept and my Atari Jaguar, and we would play our video games when friends were over. Again, we were teenagers, so by the time it was still the Ultra 64, and magazines were showing it and showing off the controller, this would have been before I moved to Denver, and this would have also been when I was maybe as young as 14, I can't remember the timeline. It would have been 13, 14, 15 in the years leading up to its release in 96 when I was 16. So I was probably, I'm going to guess 14 years old. Just a guess, when I first saw the picture of this when it was first revealed, the Nintendo 64 controller. And this thing, in my brain and in my buddy Matt's brain, when we saw this on the cover of a magazine one day in our basement, we could not wrap our heads around this thing. All we thought was, how the hell do you hold that thing? I mean, the trigger on the underneath was such a crazy idea, but very exciting. The analog stick, by the way, made no sense to us. This was a foreign concept. People sometimes forget, or just don't even necessarily know this, that the analog stick that we play today was created by Nintendo with the Nintendo 64 controller. Now, there were joysticks in arcades, and there were joysticks for Atari consoles and ColecoVisions and all the older stuff from the 70s and the early 80s. So joysticks existed, but a joystick is different than a thumb-controlled analog stick. And so basically Nintendo realized there was an advantage to what the joystick concept was, but it needed to be more than just the one thing your controller was, like an Atari 2600 controller. It needed to be something more tactile and more helpful for standard games, more complex games. And they realized they could make one for the thumb, but beyond that, they also introduced the idea of range. And I don't know what the technology would be called, but the fact that you can move the thumbstick slightly and get like a different reaction than if you move it all of the way, such as tiptoeing, walking, or running, That was mind-blowing. That blew our minds. It was not something we had ever considered even possible or needed for a video game. But as Nintendo was stepping into 3D with the Nintendo 64, when 3D gaming was just a new concept in general, they knew from the jump. They knew from before they released the system, they needed to base their system, their graphics, and their games around the idea of needing this analog stick. And so, moving on from just the history of the console itself, we also have to talk about arguably the most important part of any console, and the most important part of the Nintendo 64, which is the games. And there's no doubt that the Nintendo 64 launched with not only one of the best video games of all time, but in my personal opinion, I think it's the best launch game of all time. Maybe not the most important, certainly not the best selling. I think this Super Mario Bros. For the NES might be the most important launch game of all time. A lot of people would say Breath of the Wild is maybe the best quality launch game of all time for the Nintendo Switch, and there's a case to be made for all of these. But factoring in both a combination of my personal bias as a fan of the Nintendo 64, but also some objectively positive impacts of Mario 64, I really do think Mario 64 is the best launch game of all time, because there was a heavy responsibility on Mario 64. It had to not only launch Nintendo's new console, the third home console they'd ever made at the time, it also had to successfully usher in 3D graphics and 3D gameplay and be a successful Mario game and show us why that controller that I just spent a bunch of minutes talking about was so important and so needed. There is some fantastic video footage that I'm hoping I can find that was from, I believe, CES, the year that the analog stick and the Nintendo 64 were introduced and Mario 64 was there and playable, and this was such a different time than nowadays, pre-internet and live streaming, and it was just very different. And there's a room of people who are, I don't know, reporters, game developers, folks who work at Nintendo. It was essentially Nintendo demoing and showing off the Nintendo 64 console, Mario 64 the game, and the controller. And they used Mario 64 as a showcase for how if you slowly move the analog stick, he's going to tiptoe. You move it a little bit more, he's going to walk. You move it all the way, he's going to run. And showing off that 3D space gameplay and activity, as well as how the analog stick made a difference. And it's crazy because the cameras are going nuts, just photoing a little CRT TV, again, very different era. And you can hear people gasping and clapping and just being awestruck at what they were seeing, because this was a concept that was new to all of us. And even though the PlayStation and Saturn in the same era were introducing 32-bit versions of 3D gameplay, they weren't nearly as successful as Nintendo was with the 64 out of the gate. And a great example is watching this video of Mario 64 being demoed. I've talked about a couple of memories that are burned into my brain for the rest of time until I die, such as when my older brother brings home an NES and I first saw The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. On our old TV, when again I was probably 5 years old, in 1985 or 86, whenever that would have been. I think 86 in the States, actually. So maybe I was 6 years old. But another one that's burned into my brain that makes me love and appreciate the Nintendo 64 is Mario 64, and it's specifically Dire Dire Docks and the music playing. Because that's one of the earlier, it's like the second or third world you kind of gain access to through jumping through the paintings. And it's so different from the first area that I'm now forgetting what that one's called, but it's the most famous area because it's the first one with the cannons and all that, and the bombs are all over the place. But you go to Dire Dire Docks, and suddenly it's got a different color palette. The music is calm and chill. You're swimming. You're going underwater. You're just like, the scope and the breadth of this game is unlike anything we'd ever seen. Just the second or third world you make it to starts to give you this feeling beyond the first frickin' time you turn it on and start running around the field outside of the castle. It's just crazy. And so for me, you know, I was, again, 16 years old at the time, and I remember spending so much of my free time after school. I was a high school student, obviously. I had my first job ever at Burger King, and playing Mario 64 as much as I could, just soaking in this new incredible console and these graphics and this new Mario game. And that level made such an impact to me, and the incredible music and the way it would build and swell and the drum beat would come and go based on the area that you're in. It just took over my imagination. It took over my brain. And I remember for weeks, I would come home from school and have to go right to work at Burger King, and I would be sitting there on the fryer making French fries at Burger King as a 16-year-old, totally oblivious to everything around me, just in robotic autopilot mode, frying fries and dumping them in a big thing. And my brain was just replaying Mario 64, it was replaying the graphics, it was replaying that music. And all I could think of was I can't wait to finish work and go home and just play Mario 64 until my eyes bleed and my thumbs fall off. It was just everything to me. And again, it goes back to that nostalgia of, I think, that impressionable time when you're younger, when you're a teenager, and these things make such an impact. And I'm really glad that I was the age I was when the Nintendo 64 came out, and that I was a young person when gaming was first taking off, and I was a teenager when it was starting to evolve into 3D, you know? I would be very depressed if I was somebody who grew up in the era with the internet and social media and Twitter and smartphones and online gameplay. Like, I just think it's a less fun time to grow up in for gaming. It's still fun to game, but growing up in this era, I just feel like the stars aligned, and I feel very blessed I was born at the time I was in relation to the gaming hobby, so that I could experience this console and that game at that age, because it was everything to me. Now, one thing I have to address is the lack of Metroid, right? Because I am known as the Metroid superfan, one of many, I guess, on the internet and on YouTube. Half of my reputation, I think, is based off of that. And yeah, it's my favorite franchise. My favorite game of all time is Metroid Prime. And the Nintendo 64 somehow managed to be one of only 2 home consoles Nintendo has ever made that did not have a Metroid game, the Wii U being the other one. And I love the Wii U too, by the way. But yeah, the Nintendo 64, it didn't get a Metroid game. We had Metroid on the NES, we had Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo, we had Metroid 2 on the Game Boy. By the time the Nintendo 64 came around, we had a Mario game to launch, we got introduced to Pilot Wings, we got introduced to Wave Race. These are very early, like, launch era, launch window games for the Nintendo 64. Because it only launched with 2 games, by the way. It only launched with Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64. I love Pilot Wings as well, by the way. So it's just, everything is great. Wave Race was very soon after, an amazing game. You know, and eventually we got a couple of Zelda games, and we got a Kirby game, and we got Yoshi's Island, I think, and Yoshi's Story? Or no, Yoshi's Story was the one that came out on the 64, sorry. I always confuse Yoshi's Island and Yoshi's Story, I don't know why. We got plenty of other great games. We got great third-party games. We got games like Turok. We got games like Killer Instinct. I mean, do we talk about things like GoldenEye? The library is actually very strong for the Nintendo 64. But at the same time, it didn't get a Metroid game. Of course, many of us know that Metroid Prime really kind of started as a Nintendo 64 game. Same with Star Fox Adventures. You know, some GameCube titles that were originally being developed for the Nintendo 64. Things didn't pan out for the Metroid game that was being developed for the 64, and eventually it got moved to their following console, the Dolphin, that became the GameCube, that created my favorite game ever, Metroid Prime. A very fun story, but it did unfortunately leave that gap in the Nintendo 64's first-party library, where one of its main pillar franchises at the time didn't get the follow-up to the mega successful and popular Super Metroid. Which, by the way, Super Metroid released in 1994, only 2 years before the Nintendo 64 itself came out, so it's just kind of interesting when you play out that timeline. So one would say, Rob, how can you love the Nintendo 64 more than anything? There are 0, count them, 0 Metroid games on the Nintendo 64. And while it's a good point that I cannot deny, all I can say is, what I was saying at the beginning of this is that a lot of my love of the Nintendo 64, yes, I do think it's a quality console, better than some people feel, but a lot of it is nostalgia. It goes back to everything I was saying. I was 16, you know, I was a high school student. I had my first job working in fast food, and I was hanging out with my friends, and we were excited about video games, and along comes this amazingly powerful, you know, this is back when graphics and power really made a difference in how excited we got about video games, especially as kids and teenagers. And along comes this console with this crazy controller, but this amazing Mario game at launch. Ocarina of Time changed the face of gaming forever. And just, you know, this was an era where you could still go and rent games from Blockbuster. There was a lot of cultural things and things appropriate to just my age as a teenager that all factor into my nostalgic love and memory of when I was playing the 64. A lot of it is my memory of playing the 64 and how much I loved it, but another part of it is just my memory of the era that the 64 launched within. So again, that's why I said in the beginning, I'm not trying to talk about the 64 is the objectively best video game console ever made. I'm using my personal lens and my personal life experience to explain why it's my favorite. Even though there's no Metroid games, my memory just can't be topped. So I'd already briefly mentioned some of these other incredible games. I don't think I need to go any further into this and make this video any long. I think I've gushed long enough about the console as I intended. But again, we know about games like GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. We know about the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. We know about Jet Force Gemini, Killer Instinct Gold, the Turok franchise. By the way, I love the first Turok game. I love them all, but the first one holds a special place in my heart. Doom 64. I mean, it had first-person games. It had fighting games like Mortal Kombat Trilogy and Mortal Kombat 4. No Street Fighter to my knowledge, but it had plenty of other great games. And yeah, it was a little bit clunky and it's slow, and by today's standards, a lot of the general gameplay and graphics don't hold up the best, but that is that era. This was the first era of 3D games, 3D polygon games, whether you're talking about the 64, PlayStation, or Saturn. This was the beginning, man. And if you weren't there to experience it, it might be hard to look back and find some kind of appreciation for it. Admittedly, 8 and 16-bit games in some ways age better, there's no doubt. But if you were there to experience it, like I was, you could maybe understand. I mean, hell, Resident Evil 2 got a port, StarCraft got a port. Crazy releases on the Nintendo 64 that sometimes people forget about or don't talk about. So this video has been a long, long love letter to, more than anything, just my memory and my nostalgia and my fond love of the Nintendo 64. And while I could go on for much, much longer than I already have in this very long video to explain it, I think I've said enough to just kind of talk to you guys about why, as a huge game fan today in my mid-40s, when I think of all the amazing games and consoles and generations I've experienced in 44 years of life, hands down the Nintendo 64 stands atop as my personal favorite video game console ever made.